Let's begin the second learning objective. So describe the chemical messengers and receptor types associated with the peripheral nervous system. So we're going to get into the synaptic details. How are these signals being sent from one preganglionic neuron to a postganglionic neuron on both of the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons? Let's start by thinking about the neurotransmitters and the receptors, right? Because we know that that is how a synapse happens. Some type of neurotransmitter is being released from the preganglionic neuron, and it's going to cross that synaptic cleft and bind to its specific receptor on the cell body of the postganglionic neuron. And we've discussed that anatomy before. So what are the specific receptors and neurotransmitters involved? First, we have cholinergic receptors, and these are receptors that are going to bind acetylcholine. All right. We also have adrenergic receptors, and these are going to bind our catecholamines. So norepinephrine, they will also have the ability to bind epinephrine and dopamine to a lesser degree. So when we think about norepinephrine, we want to think about both as a neurotransmitter and as a hormone, because structurally it's the same chemical, but it has the ability to circulate in the bloodstream as a hormone, or it can cross within a vesicle, right? It can be in a neuron in the axon terminal within a vesicle and be released at the synaptic cleft and cross and bind to a receptor as a neurotransmitter. So same chemical compound, it can behave like a hormone if it's released from the medulla of the adrenal gland and circulates in the blood, or it can behave like a neurotransmitter if it is packaged in a vesicle and it is released at the synapse. Let's think about the different neurotransmitters and what types of neurons secrete them. So the preganglionic neurons are always cholinergic. They are all going to secrete acetylcholine. Now, this is going to be true for both the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Both of the preganglionic neurons will always secrete acetylcholine. So that's kind of a rule of thumb that you can stick to. If it's a preganglionic neuron, it is always releasing acetylcholine. All right. On the postganglionic neurons, it's going to differ. So if it's a postganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic side, it will also secrete or release acetylcholine. In other words, both parasympathetic neurons will release acetylcholine. On the sympathetic side, the postganglionic neurons, except for sweat glands, are going to release norepinephrine. So for the postganglionic neurons specific to the sympathetic division, they will release norepinephrine, excepting the postganglionic neurons that are going to sweat glands. They will also release acetylcholine. And then when we think about the hormones released from the adrenal medulla, it is going to be 80% epinephrine and then 20% norepinephrine, and then again, a very small, minuscule amount of dopamine. So that will also be able to circulate in the blood and bind to receptors. It's just going to be a different form of release than we do with postganglionic neurons. So here is just comparing those three different routes. So here's our preganglionic neuron from the central nervous system, again, thoracolumbar segments, a short preganglionic neuron synapsing onto either the sympathetic chain, right? This is going to be the first example of the sympathetic chain. So here we have acetylcholine being released from this neuron. So it's a cholinergic neuron, and it's going to bind to a nicotinic receptor. We're going to talk about what that is, but that is a fast receptor. You can make a note of that as being an immediate or quick or fast receptor. Then we have a postganglionic neuron arising from the sympathetic chain, going all the way out to the peripheral target tissues. And that second neuron is going to be an adrenergic neuron because we're on the sympathetic division. So that second neuron will release norepinephrine, et cetera, and that is going to bind to an adrenergic receptor, which is located on the affected organs. The second pathway for the sympathetic nervous system is to the adrenal medulla. So we have a preganglionic neuron, also cholinergic, also releasing acetylcholine, also binding to a nicotinic or fast receptor, which is located on these chromaffin cells. And then from there, epinephrine is being released, and that is going to circulate in the blood and then bind to adrenergic receptors that are also on these affected tissues. The third route is going to a ganglia that is a collateral ganglia. It's not a part of the sympathetic chain. So same thing happens, acetylcholine, nicotinic receptor, and then now we have norepinephrine released from the postganglionic neuron, also binding to an adrenergic receptor on the distal tissues. So the three types of routes or pathways in the sympathetic nervous system, and notice that they're all having the preganglionic neurons be cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine, and then all having the postganglionic neurons or the chromaffin cells being adrenergic, releasing either norepinephrine or epinephrine, and then binding to their unique adrenergic receptors. For the parasympathetic, there's only one route. So there aren't these three separate routes, the way that we see in the sympathetic side. There's one long preganglionic neuron synapsing to ganglia. It's going to also be cholinergic and bind to a nicotinic fast receptor. Then there is a short postganglionic neuron, which is also cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine. So both neurons here are cholinergic. However, the type of cholinergic receptor differs. So the cholinergic receptor that is on the cell body of the postganglionic neuron is nicotinic. It's fast. It's going to open automatically because the receptor is also a channel. We've talked about that type of fast or ionotropic receptor. On the tissue itself, it is still a cholinergic receptor, but it's a different type of cholinergic receptor. Here, it's a muscarinic cholinergic receptor, and that is going to be a metabotropic receptor. In other words, the receptor is not a channel. So the type of response here is going to be more of a slow response. We're going to have G proteins, and we're going to have more messengers in the way in order to bring about the response here. So while they are both cholinergic receptors in that they can both bind acetylcholine, one is going to be fast and one is going to be slow. So just to describe that here further, so our nicotinic cholinergic receptors, also called ionotropic, they cause the opening of cation channels, which is what's going to rapidly depolarize the neuron. And then they're going to result in the stimulation of the postganglionic neuron. And then they're going to result in the release from that second neuron. The muscarinic receptors are metabotropic. So they are coupled to a G protein, and the effect is going to depend on exactly where that receptor is. So the reason for that is twofold. One is you want to have a more targeted response. So first of all, when we have that acetylcholine binding to the muscarinic receptor, we want to have a targeted, sort of specific or customized response on each type of tissue. So the response is not going to look the same on the lungs as it does in the heart, right? That's important to remember. So we want to have a G protein coupled response that's going to release a specific second messenger in each area that's going to bring about the desired effect on every single type of tissue, which can be unique. With the nicotinic receptors, the response is not unique. It's going to be immediately depolarizing that postganglionic neuron. And so we have a fast type of receptor here because there isn't as much customization happening on the postganglionic neuron. So it can be an immediate opening of ion channels and immediately depolarizing that neuron. Let's look at the location of these cholinergic receptors. So the autonomic postganglionic neuron, that is the cell body of those neurons, have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. That is on all postganglionic neurons. So because all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, all postganglionic neurons have nicotinic cholinergic receptors to bind that acetylcholine. On the effector tissues for the parasympathetic side, it's a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. When we look at the skeletal muscle, we're going to look at nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And then the specific example or exception rather for the sweat glands is that they have muscarinic receptors even on the sympathetic side. So as we mentioned previously, all of the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, for the most part, they release norepinephrine or epinephrine. They are adrenergic. But sweat glands on the postganglionic side of the sympathetic system are the specific exception where they release acetylcholine, which binds to muscarinic receptors that are located on those sweat glands. Let's talk about the various subclasses of an adrenergic receptor. So we looked at the two main types of cholinergic, which were nicotinic and muscarinic. Let's look at the many different subtypes of adrenergic receptors. And so the unique feature here is that they can all bind either norepinephrine, epinephrine, or in some cases, dopamine. And remember, these can be bound to these receptors either as a hormone or as a neurotransmitter. So they are going to be coupled to G proteins. So they're going to be slow in their response and also customized or more targeted in their response. There are two main subclasses, alpha and beta. And within these, we have further subdivisions. So alpha 1 and alpha 2, and then beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. So their properties are going to be different depending on where they're located, what specific type of tissue they're on, whether it's the heart or adipose or lungs. They are going to have different properties. So for the adrenergic receptors specifically, these are the most abundant, they're the most common, and they're located on the different types of target tissues. These are usually seen on blood vessels, the smooth muscle that's located on our blood vessels. These are usually excitatory, all right? And they usually have a greater affinity for norepinephrine versus epinephrine. So that is just distinguishing our alpha adrenergic receptors.